Hello everyone, this study was called Personality in Personalisation, a user study with an interactive narrative, a personality test and a personalized short story. It's a user study developed to explore the use of psychological frameworks for the personalization of narratives. It also explores using interactive narratives to understand the user's personality and narrative preferences. The study consists of 3 sections: an interactive narrative, a personality test, and a personalized short story. Whilst it would appear that at least this interactive narrative could not be used as a personality test per se, it was able to capture some traits. The personalization appeared to work well, especially regarding relating with the protagonist. It was also found that extroverted people appear to prefer reading narratives with less formal language, and introverts prefer narratives with more formal language. The 5-factor model, or FFM, has often been considered the gold standard of personality psychology. It features 5 traits: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to experience. These factors have been found in many studies to influence preferences in narratives and media. And on the other hand, the need for affect, or NFA, how motivated people are to seek emotion-inducing situations and activities, has also been used to predict engagement with negative and ambivalent emotion in narratives. And some of the examples of studies on Big 5 or FFM traits and media preferences include Nagel, Wolf, and Reina, 2010, who applied the Big 5 for adjusting difficulty in a first-person shooter game, and Van Langveld et al. 2011, who found a correlation between gameplay metrics and all the 5 factors, and De Lima, Feijo, and Furtado, 2018, who created a method for creating a Big 5 profile during gameplay for the players, which are then used to define their quests. There have been various studies and versatile results on the topic of what sort of personal characteristics would explain enjoyment of negative emotions in art. One promising approach could be the need for affect, or NFA, which refers to how motivated people are to seek emotion-inducing situations and activities. The willingness to see happy and sad films rather than less emotional films has been found to be higher for individuals with a high NFA. It is conceptually similar to sensation seeking, but has been found to be empirically distinct. And high NFA scores appear to match with willingness to watch films with effectively negative content, but only in females. And people with high NFA appear to enjoy horror films more. It has been called the first personality trait to be a consistent predictor of individuals' engagement with negative and ambivalent emotional experiences regardless of gender or genre. Use modeling has been widely used to adapt computer games, but relatively little to determine storylines, often using factorial models of user types in interactive narratives. It has been used to assess emotional state, comprehension, and narrative preference in different studies. There is also some work on personalizing language, typically with chatbots. It has been used to make slight stylistic variations, such as in the use of swear words or exclamation marks or stuttering and so forth, and for altering between first and third person narratives, and also the shyness levels of characters' language. The study had 59 participants, 17 women, 36 men, volunteers of all ages above 18 who were found by posting about the study on internet discussion boards on interactive narratives and other relevant topics. The first part is an interactive narrative. The second section is personality test, a 10-item FFM questionnaire and a 10-item NFA questionnaire. And the third and final section is the personalized narrative. The first part was an interactive narrative specifically written for the study. It uses a second-person perspective where the user assumes the role of the protagonist and makes choices that determine what the protagonist does and how the plot advances. All but one of the 25 questions simulate a personality questionnaire on a 5-point Likert scale, with the possible options ranging from one extreme to another, measuring either one of the factors in a 5-factor model or the need for effect. The questions relating to FFM are about how the protagonist responds in the situation, for example in a very extroverted or a very introverted manner, and the questions measuring NFA are about deciding what happens next, ranging from something lighthearted to something very dark. Most choices do not affect the narrative trajectory, except for 3 questions, resulting in 30 different ways the story could end up. In the final part, the users are presented with a short story written for the experiment and personalized for them. Users were split into 3 different groups randomly. Each had similar traits on average. Users are defined as being either high or low in a given trait and are given a version that matches with that. Group 1 have this done according to the results of the interactive narrative presented, Group 2 according to the personality test, and one control group who gets the opposite of what they get in Group 1. The users are asked how much they like the story and the language, and how much they identified with the protagonist. The narrative has 2 different versions, one with high and one with low extroversion. This affects the use of language throughout every section. The story is then split into 6 different sections, and apart from the section that is the same for everyone in the same extroversion pathway, there are 2 versions of each section under both extroversion pathways depending on whether the user has a high or low score in a given trait. The protagonist's personality depends on the user's FFM scores other than extroversion, and the ending on NFA. A high NFA indicates a preference for a more emotional, tragic ending, and a low NFA, a less emotional, somewhat happy ending. Therefore, there are 64 different versions of the story. A PSE interactive narrative was able to make an approximate assessment of the user's extroversion and emotional stability, but not the other traits. NFA, according to the interactive narrative, did not have any significant correlations with anything, especially with NFA according to the personality test, but got close to significant correlations with agreeableness according to the personality test, or PT, and with openness according to the personality test. Both negative but not quite significant. The interactive narrative also appears good at judging openness in those identifying as women, but for men the correlation is actually negative. Neither are quite statistically significant. Particularly for women, statistical significance was hard to reach due to the small number of participants who identified as women, 17. According to Kruskal-Wallis test, the only statistically significant intergroup difference for the ratings for the story was with the language, with a P of 0.022. However, the scores between the groups are not directly comparable. For example, Group 2 got the sad ending much more than others, which could skew the results slightly in their favor since that ending was more liked on average. This is because users tended to get high NFA scores in the personality test group with an average of 0.61, which defines personalization of Group 2, but the results were more balanced in the interactive narrative group, with an average of 0.45, and this was used in groups 1 and 3. Nevertheless, it is easy to note that the control group performed the worst in every aspect, suggesting that the personalization did improve the experience. Looking at the top line here of the table 3 here, we can note that extroversion, according to the PT, had 0.387 correlation with relating with the protagonist in the high extroversion version of the short story, but the negative 0.24 in the low extroversion version, meaning that the more extroverted the user is, the more they relate with the protagonist if the language used is extroverted, but if the language is introverted, the reverse happens. The more introverted the user is, the more they relate. The p-value for such a difference in correlations is 0.021. There were many such correlations differences, with only the statistically significant ones presented here in table 3. We can also note that adjusting the language depending on level of extroversion worked well regarding liking the language, and in the case of the personality test, also with respect to relating with the protagonist, who was also the narrator. Personalization based on conscientiousness and emotional stability, IN, also works particularly well in making the protagonist relatable. Openness, PT, indicated liking the happier, less emotional ending, and therefore would apparently have been better for personalizing the ending than NFA was, though NFA, according to the interactive narrative, appeared to work too, but did not quite reach the significance. NFA, according to the personality test, seemed to have the opposite effect, which would have reached significance without removing the fast experiment takers. However, NFA, according to the interactive narrative, did work in making the protagonist relatable. Generally, the interactive narrative worked in many ways much better than the personality test, though many correlations weren't found quite significant and therefore weren't mentioned here. Gender was also a major factor with the ending specifically. For men, the ending made little to no difference, as versions with the happy ending were found just marginally better. However, for women, the sad ending was greatly preferred, with an average rating of 3.71 versus 2.6. So it was found that extroverted people appear to prefer reading narratives with less formal language, and introverts prefer narratives with more formal language, or specifically the types of language extroverts and introverts have been found to write. This does not appear to have been tested before. Whilst it would appear that at least this interactive narrative could not be used as a personality test per se, it was able to capture some traits, specifically extroversion and emotional stability. It is possible that with agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience, people might indeed have a preference to act within fiction differently from how they would act in reality. For example, someone who is agreeable in reality might want to get a safe experience of what it is like to be rude. Whether they would then want to see the protagonist behaving like this as well, or preferably like they would in reality, is an open question. We should also consider the possibility that the personality test did not measure traits ideally. Short versions were used to not bother the participants too much, but longer versions might have been more accurate. On the other hand, some people could have been rather uninterested in the personality test section and clicked through it rather carelessly, and making it longer would have been just exacerbated such a problem. It is therefore possible that interactive narratives could capture at least some aspects of personality even better than personality tests, and in fact the interactive narrative was at least as good as the personality test for personalization. Questions in personality tests can be rather abstract and open to interpretation, even ambiguous, but in an interactive narrative, the user is put into a specific situation in a rather concrete manner. NFA, however, did not appear to work as intended, except with the way the interactive narrative interpreted it. Therefore, perhaps NFA, according to the interactive narrative, could be redefined simply as a preference for tragic rather than light-hearted themes in narratives. Perhaps this could be called preference for tragedy, or PFT. The personalization with individual FFM traits also appear to work well for relating with the protagonist. However, the effect could have been limited by the fact that the sections displaying the protagonist's personality were rather brief. Therefore, that a type of personalization did not appear to work with this story does not mean that it could not work when done better in a longer narrative or with more participants. And that it did appear to work here could in some cases be down to just chance. Similarly, at least some of the questions in the interactive narrative could have been just poorly made. Therefore, more similar studies would be helpful. Other ways of personalization could also be done based on FFM, such as more novelty for people with high openness for experience. Next, we plan to try natural language processing for altering the writing style, which could vastly ease the process. In the future, it should be studied how interactive narratives could be used better for capturing personality. More such narratives should be written, and the kinds of choices that best correlate with personality scores should be chosen for further usage. Such choices would not necessarily have to be on a Likert scale. Collaborative filtering could also be used, and with enough participants and questions, surprising links could be found, which in turn could help personality research as well. And finally, the user profile that's created could also be later used for a recommender system, particularly with narratives, but possibly with other domains as well. It has indeed been found that FFM can be useful in recommenders, particularly when there is little data available on the user, as well as for increasing the diversity of recommendations. Ultimately, the approach could be used to personalize just about every aspect of narratives, as well as to recommend and perhaps generate more. Thank you.